I'm actually an architectural historian. Some of you may have heard me speak on occasion. So I'm not the most knowledgeable person on the Jewish history in Syracuse. I'm Jewish. I've only lived in Syracuse for 23 years, so I'm still a newcomer. But I think I know enough to fill up our time and to give you some insight and maybe some broad perspective on Jewish settlement and history here. I'm not using the title that got abbreviated in the publicity, The Jews of Central New York. There's no such thing as the Jews, like there's the blacks, the Italians, the Poles. No, there are many different aspects of Jews, Judaism, Jewish community, Jewish culture in Central New York. And we'll touch on a few of those. I will say that early on, it was much easier to talk about the Jews, back when a small number of Jews settled here in the early 19th century. But over almost 2 centuries, we're coming up pretty soon to the bicentennial of Jewish presence here in the Syracuse area. There's been such diversity that it's hard to generalize. Even a Jewish history is difficult because there are many Jewish histories. There's the institutional history, which includes synagogues and charitable institutions, educational institutions, social institutions. There's the business history, the commercial history, the professional history, the craft history, all about what people did most of the time, all those days of the week when they weren't in synagogues doing obligatory or desired worship. And then, of course, there are the family histories and the personal histories. And these are what most people actually hold most dear, though these are the hardest to excavate. These are the hardest to find and to document. I was just reminded of well, I know it very well. There's a wonderful Facebook group run by Robin Meltzer called Memories of the 15th Ward, in which about 400 people have joined, and they share a lot of those memories, mostly family and personal memories, and memories about the schools they went to, the synagogues they went to, but a lot of it's where you got the best brisket sandwich, where you got the best soda, and that sort of thing. I find it particularly interesting. I read it voyeuristically because it relates to a Jewish time before my arrival in the early 1990s, and it really goes back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, when the 15th Ward was intact before urban renewal, and there was a totally different reality and perception for Jews and non-Jews of what being Jewish in Syracuse and Central New York meant. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the history today. We're going to look at some of the buildings. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the groups, mention a few of the notable personalities. It's not going to be a complete history, but I will refer you to several other places that you can go to learn more. First off, this is because I'm a teacher, I have to give you a bibliography. The Bible for Jewish history in Syracuse is still a book that was published in 1970 by B.G. Rudolph, which is called From a Minion to a Community. The Rudolph family ran jewelry stores. They had about 60 jewelry stores. They were very successful commercially, very involved philanthropically, and B.G. Rudolph was an amateur, but very, very competent historian. And he was alive and doing this work at a time when there were still enough people with long enough memories that he could collect written documents, journals, letters, newspaper accounts, contracts, but he could also talk to people about the true meaning of those things and collect a lot of them into this history. So this is unparalleled, and it could not be written today. We can add a lot more because there's been decades that have passed, but also new sources become available. But it's still the essential story of the Jewish community in this region. More recently, there have been several illustrated books. I see one of them is over here in the library, A Place That Lives Only in Memory, the Old Jewish neighborhood of Syracuse, New York. There's one of these Arcadia books on the Jewish community of Syracuse, done by, I think, Howard Port and Barbara Davis, which has lots of pictures. And then most recently, there have been some videos, and this one came out about 2 years ago, done by a guy named Jay Lurie. It's heavily drawn from Minyan to a community, and also uses a lot of those personal accounts from the Facebook page, and uses a lot of those people's memories. It's called Stories from the Jewish Community. I won't give a criticism of it as a film. It's not, Steven Spielberg, or not any great documentarians, but it's packed filled with great information. And any of you who have grown up in the Jewish community also recognize lots and lots of people and places. So it's a fun movie for about an hour and a half. I think he's got a new one that's just come out, which has additional material, and it's more about places, but I haven't seen that yet. Okay, so when we talk about Jewish history in Syracuse, we have to go back to the Erie Canal. Pretty much everything here goes back to the canal, and of course we're coming up on the bicentennial of the canal. It was begun, I think the first spades went in right about now, 200 years ago, but it was not finished till 1825. And it was the canal that drew the first Jews here. When the canal was started, virtually nobody was in Syracuse. Syracuse didn't even exist by name. Oh, let's see, we're gonna try to use this, right? Do I just, this is... It's not set up? Oh, okay, so will that take time, or then I can... Syracuse in the 20s really was mostly what is now the, up on the north side, the old First Ward, was the village of Salina, which was laid out in 728 to take advantage of the salt on Lake Onondaga. What we know of as Syracuse was just beginning to be laid out down here around Salina and Genesee. That was the main intersection, a place called Bogartis Corners. And then gradually it spread out in the 1830s and beyond into this area, which is half of what is now Hawley Green. And then here's the canal that came in the 20s, and you begin getting more development on this side as well. So do I just press this?
Yep, to the right.
Because I have to go to the right. Okay. Oops, no, the other way. No, I think it's hooked up to the wrong file. Okay, so that was. So you've got to find it. Okay, so Jews came up in the, probably there were already some Jews here because we know there was a trading store, Bernheimer and Block, and it was a branch of a large commercial enterprise in New York City that outfitted peddlers. So it's where people could go to get all the knickknacks that they would fill their packs, or if they were a little wealthier, their carts to take around and sell to people in towns and villages, because there was very little commercial life. So now I should try it. Think it'll work? No, that's not. It's still not. I'm going to just do it this way. Okay. Oh, but now we have to go to full. People would get this stuff and then go out into little villages. Germans and Jews and other people found peddling a great way to break into the economy in America. They came with very little money. They would buy a pack load or two of knickknacks on credit, and then they would head out, sell their things, slowly pay off their credit. And their goal was always to make enough money so they could stop peddling and open a little store. Now, some of those stores, turned into Neiman Marcus and Filene's and all these big department stores around the country, Kaufman's and Pittsburgh. But most people were satisfied with a small dry goods store or a hardware store or whatever they chose to specialize. So there was one of these stores, a branch of the New York store, already in existence in Syracuse, a place called Speaker's Basin on the Erie Canal. And I'm not exactly sure where Speaker's Basin is. I was looking on the Erie Canal website and trying to find it, but I think it might have been actually over in what's now DeWitt. But it was a place where people could come and buy sundries and then go out peddling. So probably in 1838, 39, the date is disputed. Some people say 1842, but sometime in the 1830s, a group of 12 New Yorkers, Jewish New Yorkers, heard about opportunities in Syracuse, knew that it was sort of undeveloped territory, so that they might stake out some peddling routes. And they came up by the canal, and they picked up their goods at this Jewish outpost, where they were also able to have the first worship services with the required 10 men recorded in Syracuse history, and then they began their work and lives. That store went through several different iterations, and there were several other ones too. This is Cohen's big canal store, probably built a little bit later, but it's the same kind of place, run by Jews and serving not only Jews but other people too. So country people would come in to buy their supplies here, but also peddlers could stock up. This group of peddlers created the core group that would create the first official community, which was Knesset Shalom, the Congregation of Peace, the Community of Peace, which translates in English as Society of Concord, in the very fancy language of the 19th century, Concord being peace, society being the congregation. And it gradually became Temple Society of Concord. Today it's shortened to Temple Concord. But the history of this congregation goes back to 1838-39, and the papers of incorporation are from 1842. So Jews used this area along the canal, but they tended to settle down here in this area south of what today is Jefferson Street. And it's the area pretty much from State Street to I-81. And that was actually what would become the heart of the 15th Ward. State Street and Harrison, where the Everson Museum is today, was actually the site of the first purpose-built synagogue in Syracuse. When Concord got enough funds to build, they were meeting in Myers Saloon, upstairs from Myers Saloon, called a beautiful place. Saloon probably didn't have quite the sleazy, it wasn't quite this, it wasn't the sawdust or more sleazy type place. It was probably more of a club or restaurant, but they were upstairs. They were meeting there from 1846, and then in 1851 they had enough money to hire a prominent architect here to build their synagogue, which we'll see in a minute. We don't have pictures from those first decades, but we have pictures of some of those people a little bit later on, and their families and their descendants. So this guy, Moses Bloom, who's shown here as an adult, actually came in this first wave as a young boy with his parents, who were among the pioneers. But all of these, you can see these faces, they're looking serious because you had to stand still for a long time for photographs in that time. But also, probably they were serious because they'd led hard lives. They'd worked hard to get some level of security and financial success. Many of the first generation barely made it beyond the level of peddler, but they succeeded enough so that they and their children could open shops. Some of them were manufacturing enterprises, as we'll see in a minute. Some of them were small hardware, dry goods shops, and others. They were definitely what we would call today lower middle class, but a few of them obtained considerable success, and they could bankroll the needs of the less fortunate in the Jewish tradition. So this is the first temple conquered. It's the first Jewish building, purpose-built Jewish building in central New York, erected in 1851. It looks like what? What does it look like? A church, yeah, except it's got some Hebrew on it, and it has a star in the window. It had a tower, but the synagogue was circumcised, and the tower, actually the tower, it was an accidental circumcision. A storm blew the tower off. Perhaps it was a message that synagogue shouldn't be too church-like. But it uses Gothic detailing, and the whole arrangement is church-like. And the architect Hayden was known for having built the First Presbyterian Church, which was the most prominent religious building in the city at that time. There was recently an article about him in the Onondaga Historical Association History Highlights, which you can see. We don't have this building anymore. This plaque, though, from the building, which lists the trustees, those who probably put up the most money, and the building committee was saved, and this was incorporated into the second purpose-built Temple Conquered building, which is the one you saw on the first slide, which was built in 1910-11. And you can see the names. They're mostly German Jewish names. Stone was originally Stein. Garson, sometimes known as Gerson, ran the boarding house, the kosher boarding house, where all of the peddlers used to stay when they first came to Syracuse. And a number of these families, Hennigsburg, for instance, Brunner, Oppenheimer, we continue to have their names for several generations. None of these families, though, still survive in Syracuse that I know of. In 1851, for the dedication of this synagogue, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss came. He was then 27 years old. He was en route, really, from Europe to his destination. He was not yet the famous Isaac Mayer Weiss, who essentially became the father of Reform Judaism in America, created Hebrew Union College and the American, Union of American Hebrew Congregations, based out of Cincinnati. He was still learning his way. This was his first stop. He'd come up the canal heading west, and he spent 2 weeks here because the dedication was postponed. And during the process, he was exposed to his first American experience. He talks about Hennigsburg, for instance, in his diary, who was one of his hosts, and about how witty and educated he was, and he was very impressed with the people he met in Syracuse. So it tells us something a little bit about the people at that time. Now, these were German Jews. These were German Jews, and they were very devout. They were very Orthodox in our parlance today. They didn't use the term Orthodox at the time. They were traditional Jews, mostly from southern Germany and from Alsace. Maybe there were a few from Bohemia. This was the source of emigration from Europe to America. And they came from small towns in Germany, and they essentially settled in what were still small towns in America. Within a very few years, a second synagogue was created. This synagogue building, known as the Grape Street Shul, also Orthodox, was founded in the Minyan was 1844, so just 2 years after the incorporation of Concord, and they built their building in 56, 5 years after Concord built their building. Now, who were these Jews? Well, they were also Orthodox, so why did they need another synagogue? Well, those of you who are Jews know when there are two Jews, you need three synagogues, because there's the one Jew, two synagogues, the one you go to and the one you wouldn't be caught dead in. In this case, this congregation included some English-speaking Jews. The others were all German-speaking, and they brought in Dutch Jews and Polish Jews. So basically, it was everyone who felt uncomfortable in the heavily German Concord. They set up their own congregation. And this is the existed for quite some time. Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. These are the guys who met at Meyer's Saloon. not Concord met upstairs in a store. So we have got 2 congregations now, so the population is growing. There are certainly probably upwards to 100 Jewish families. And amazingly, out of this small community, when the Civil War hits, the Jewish community in Syracuse is just one of 2 Jewish communities in the entire country that raises a whole company out of its own congregation. So the call for volunteers goes out, and 20 Jewish men sign up at the synagogue. And in 1862, the ladies of Syracuse, the Jewish ladies, make a banner, a regimental banner, which now is in Albany. The soldiers suffer. I mean, there were several deaths, a lot of injuries which affected people for their lives, and other people died later of their wounds. So it was a very traumatic experience for a small community. But for Concord, it was a defining moment as well. If there was ever a time that you have to find, when did the Reformed Jews, when did Syracuse Jews feel that they were American first, when they were it's during this period of the Civil War. And they also allied themselves with progressive movements, the abolitionists, and later Jews would also, some Jews would be active in the women's rights movement, but not so much officially, but more through action than through word. But there was a civil war going on in the synagogue, in the congregation as well. Not just the split that had already happened between the English and Polish Jews and the German Jews. Within the congregation in Concord, there was a split because of those ideas that Isaac Wise had been promulgating when he came through in 1851 were taking hold across the country. And more now American Jews wanted to behave more American and less German and less traditionally Jewish. And they wanted to introduce English into the service. They wanted to shorten the service. They wanted to allow men and women to sit together. They wanted to introduce an organ for music. They wanted to have a rabbi who would give sermons, ethical sermons like Protestant preachers. Essentially, they wanted to transform Judaism from within, but to make it more like other religious practice which they observed in America. The same was going on in Germany. The 2 trends were somewhat different. They related to each other, and sometimes they intersect. But in Germany, Jews embraced reform because it was the only way they could succeed in German society. If you wanted to get ahead in education and business, you either had to convert to Christianity or at least to give up all your clothing, your diet, and your customs and be more like the Germans. In America, you didn't have to do that. There were immigrants coming from all over the world. In Syracuse, there were Irish, there were Germans, there were Jews, and there were many others already at this time. They didn't give it up because they had to. They gave it up because they wanted to. Because they weren't required to do anything, that made them feel all the more part of the society, which they really were building from the ground up. But not everybody was happy. The original founders of the congregation, who had been these small-town German Orthodox Jews, they wanted to keep those old traditions. But they found themselves in a minority. There was kind of a coup in the congregation. It's a long story and a very nasty and bitter story, one that we still see replicated today in Jewish and Christian congregations and in all sorts of community groups when you have a takeover. I think the Republican Party just experienced this too. And the old guard, led by Solomon Rosenblum, who was a successful businessman, broke off and formed yet a third congregation. And this is called Temple Adeth Jeshurun, not like the new one, the one that exists today, which is a Y. This is another congregation. It was but it was called the Rosenblum Shul because he paid for it all. And his 7 sons were the mainstay of the congregation. But it really split the German community, and you had brothers and fathers and sons going to different congregations. And it was a real source of tension and bitterness for many, many generations. And it was only when Solomon Rosenblum died about 50 years afterward that the two communities came back together and reunited. They came back to Temple Concord. Okay. So what were these people doing? Well, the Rosenblums, as I mentioned, were very successful, but they're emblematic of the aspirations of most of these Jews. The Rosenblums started as a shoe store, and they continued to be successful shoe and boot manufacturers, but they had a big store on Warren Street, which became really a department store, that they did interior furnishings and draperies and all sorts of other stuff. This is a later building known as the Rosenblum Building, which you can see is rented to others. This is 1910, and that's just from an ad. Simon Rosenblum, one of the sons, had a hardware store, you see here advertised. And Daniel Rosenblum, another son, was a very prominent in the Democratic Party. He was actually encouraged to run for mayor, but he chose not to. He, among other things, developed properties and built houses. So he's the one who built the Gustav Stickley house, which some of you may be familiar with. That was on the Rosenblum tract, which is now Columbus Avenue. He built 6 nice houses, and his own house was on the corner. And it still stands, though, although doesn't have these arches, this porch out in front. But this is an article from the newspaper from 1901, when it was first erected. The Jewish community by 1900 really had integrated pretty much into Syracuse society. It was an immigrant city, so everybody had an opportunity, and everybody played politics, hardball politics, and Jews were part of that. Many leading Jews had positions. Gates Thalheimer was police commissioner. Somebody was education commissioner. They all played their role. There was a Jewish alderman named Levy in the seventh ward. He represented the Jews and the Irish, but that was the political alliance at the time, and it worked. You read the newspapers and you find lots of references, but always to these older congregations, always to Concord, or sometimes to the Rosenblum factor, because these were the public Jews. These were the established Jews and those who were most successful. You also hear about tragedies and social events. This was a big deal in 1906 when one of the social groups went out boating, and this engaged couple drowned, and it was a big funeral and a big media event locally. So there were other bootmakers. Stoltz was one of the first Germans to come. This photograph is from later in the century, but it's the Jacob Stoltz shop. Apparently his name was Stultz, but the first sign maker for his first sign spelled it Stoltz, and then from then on the Stoltz family was with an O. Benjamin Stoltz was one of the primary movers in the building of that 1910 Temple Concord that we saw. But the Rosenblums were the big bootmakers, shoe and bootmakers. And if you go online and Google Solomon Rosenblum or S. Rosenblum and Sons, what you're going to find are dozens of these very popular and still collectible color advertisements done with chromolithography in the late 19th century. You see they had factories in Syracuse, Auburn, and Buffalo, and stores there. They were very, very successful. Oberdorfers made hardware, and they did a lot of work with Franklin Automobile. So all of these Jews were going into retail and manufacturing. Very few what we would call the professions today: lawyers, doctors, architects, a few professors, a lot of school teachers. And that's because most of these professions were still pretty much closed to Jews, but also because these Jews really pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, so they didn't have the educational requirements to break into those professions. It was for their children and grandchildren who would do that. Now, synagogues. There were about 5 or 6, but at times there were as many as a dozen in the city. And this is from the Syracuse Blue Book of 1890, where all of the congregations of all of the denominations are listed, and there are a lot. There are a lot. There are over 100 churches and synagogues in the city of Syracuse. So here you see Jewish out of Yeshur, and that's not the one we looked at. New Beth Israel, we haven't looked at. Concord, out of Yeshurun, Israel, for these out. And where were these located? Most of them were located in that area, in that 15th Ward area. This is a 1908 map. Here's Temple Concord right here, and these are other congregations. Montgomery Street is there, and then Almond Street is here where 81 runs through. In the next generation, in that generation, the Jews will start moving across Almond Street and up the hill, and culminating in Concord in 1910-11, and then these other synagogues on the hill today. So there were a lot of these small congregations. These are not built by those Germans. These are built by the next big wave of immigrants who start coming in around 1880. And the first ones who come in around 1880 from Eastern Europe, the great Russian Empire. They're Polish, they're Lithuanian, they're all Yiddish speaking and all Orthodox. By around 1900, they're able to build congregations. These are the earliest two. This is out of Yeshur, and they're actually from Germany, from Neustadt, the city of Neustadt, and they split off from the Grape Street Shul. I forget which one they split off from. 78, and Pozenek is more Polish in 96. And you have more and more of these, and they're fairly simple brick buildings, but they have a certain amount of ornament. They do present a public face. They're not hiding from anyone, but they're not in any way monumental like some of the later synagogues. And this is the last of the batch, Anshe Sfard, which is more of a Hasidic, more of a very Orthodox Eastern European group. And they build, I think they built this, I don't think it was a pre-existing building on McBride Street in 1917. Now all of these synagogues were torn down either in the 1930s, the late 1930s, when pioneer homes were built, 1938 to 40, one of the first public funded housing projects in the United States, sponsored very much by T. Aaron Levy, who was a progressive leader in Syracuse and a Jew and a member of Temple Concord and a confidant of the Roosevelt administration. He was the first head of the housing administration in Syracuse. And when Pioneer Homes built as a model of new housing, it replaced a lot of deteriorated housing stock over a several block area. And that was mostly housing that Jews were living in, and many Jews then lived in Pioneer Home in the first iteration. Today, of course, it's almost all African American and some Hispanic. Now, this is a planned demolition for the so-called Community Plaza project in the 1960s, but the outline shows everything pretty much that was torn down in the 1950s and 60s, and actually it extends all the way out here. So pretty much all of this was, a lot of this was destroyed. The highway comes up here. And that's where all the Jewish institutions were. And it's important to remember that the institutions grew out of the community, so they were part of the community. They're rooted in the community. They are not temples on a hill like this, but they are next door to where people live. And Orthodox Jews are going to the synagogue 2 or 3 times a day to pray, the men, and the women usually at least once a week to pray on the Sabbath. So you wanted to have things close. So you had the synagogues, you had houses, and then you had shops that provided all the other needs, your kosher meat, your kosher food. You had little schoolhouses where kids could get their Hebrew education after school if they went to public school. It was all a village. It was some people called it a ghetto, but it was also a village where everything Jewish you needed in your life could be found within a few blocks radius. When that was torn down, of course, that opportunity was gone. Okay, so Jews start moving up the hill. The first group are the well-to-do Jews, those German Jews, and they go up and build where we saw 1910, 1911. They also, for the first time, hire a Jewish architect, Arnold Brunner, as the consulting architect to help with the building. Brunner is one of the leading architects in America. He's head of the AIA of New York City, the American Institute of Architects of New York City, in 1910 when he's doing this. And he's also just completing his great federal building in Cleveland the same year. So he was probably coming by train from New York out to Cleveland, and they were able to capture him. But he also probably knew Lewis Marshall. We know he knew Lewis Marshall in New York. They were on many committees together, and Lewis Marshall, who was the leading Jewish lawyer, constitutional lawyer and civil rights advocate in the country, one of the great Jews of the 20th century, was born in Syracuse, grew up on Cedar Street, which is now where Hutchins Psychiatric Center is, and was here until he was in his 40s, but he moved to New York, where he later became president of Temple Emmanuel, the largest synagogue in that city and one of the largest synagogues in the world. Brunner was both an architect and a scholar of synagogue architecture. He wrote many important articles, the first articles ever in English about synagogue architecture that were widely disseminated to both Jews and non-Jews. And he knew about recent archaeological excavations in Palestine, which were showing up ancient synagogues. So he justified using the classical style and saying that was the first appropriate Jewish style. In fact, it was also met the other needs of the congregation, meaning they wanted to be very American. They wanted their building not to look exotic, not to look like the Alhambra, not to look like a fairground, something like that. So that's Brunner, that's Marshall, and Brunner in New York had designed the Educational Institute and the Jewish Theological Seminary and Temple Congregation Shearith Israel on Central Park West and many others. So it was a big deal when Concord was built. Lots of newspaper stories. Gates Dahlheimer put up the money to get them over the hump, to get the board to commit to the project, and this was the result. It was a beautiful building, very much a temple on the hill. Reform Jews use the term temple because they're not waiting for the temple in Jerusalem to be built in the time of the Messiah. Orthodox congregations will usually just be congregation, this and that. Conservative kind of waffles. Conservative is sometimes a little bit more towards the Reform, a little bit more toward the Orthodox. So officially they might be congregation, Adath Yeshurun, but popularly they are Temple Adath. And basically conservative gets it both ways. So it's a beautiful building. If you've never been inside, you should go. It's one of the most splendid religious structures in the region. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. I know that because I wrote the nomination myself back in 2008. It is still regularly used, and it's austere. It's quite simple, and that enhances the experience. They're not stained glass windows. They're not paintings on the walls. It's really a stripped down look, which is very different from some of the ornate synagogues of the previous decades. The synagogue celebrated its centennial in 2011, and they got a little, Madison Street for this block is called Temple Concord Place because of it. So that was 1910-11. This is a program from 1915. And by the way, I took this from the 15th Ward website. Someone posted it, and I didn't write down who did, but I'm going to find it out. It's the Program for Americanization Day exercises July 4th. This is when immigrants are becoming citizens. And it's very interesting to look at the names. I haven't put the whole booklet up here. They're names from all over Europe. We don't have Asian names, we don't have African names like we do today. But a lot of them are Jewish. Samuel Koss, Max Herzog, and so on. Hyman Fogel. You can just, Louis Goldberg, Jacob Greenberg, Philip Jekyll. But here are a bunch that are Polish, and then you've got some Germans, and Nathan Gruber. So everybody was Americanizing at the time, and it was very important. And people were very proud to be Americans, and the synagogue architecture begins to show it at this time. So the next big synagogue built is Temple Adath Yeshurun, which is the successor to the Neustaedter synagogue, the one built in 1878 in a kind of Moorish style. It's now the Hotel Schuyler. For many years it was Salt City Theater, some of you may remember. It's big, it's grand, it's not quite as ornate as Temple Concord, but it certainly aspires to grandeur. It can hold a lot of people, and the congregation moved out in the 60s, and there was groundbreaking for the new Temple Adath on Kimber Road in a modern style in 1968. The third synagogue up on the hill is the former Beth Israel, or New Beth Israel, which for a while afterward was Bethany Baptist Church, and now it is a Messianic Jewish church or synagogue, depending on who you talk to. And it's done in a more exotic style, a Byzantine style, which was coming into vogue at the time in the 1920s when this was built, 1925 to 27. And just like Brunner in 1910 was talking about the original style for synagogues was classical, another Jewish architect named Alfred Altschuler in the 1920s was writing articles saying, no, Byzantine is the right style because that's when, and it goes on. So by this time, 15,000 Jews in Syracuse. This is an article from the Syracuse Herald before Passover, and they talk to all the rabbis of all the different congregations. And what you get is a sense of a community that's very diverse, but still coherent. And certainly in the eyes of the non-Jewish community, you now have a sense of respectability across the board. So the Eastern European immigrants and their congregations are now seen more or less on a par with those old German congregations. Okay. So if we look at the institutional history beyond the congregations, there are a lot of initiatives. Most of these are either charitable or they're social. One of the most important charitable efforts was created out of the Orthodox community by Rabbi Braude, who pushed the idea of a Jewish home. The Reform Jews said, we don't need a Jewish home, because they were saying they're not people dying from hunger and starvation and elderly who were left alone. I mean, they didn't know any. I mean, there are enough charities. But these Orthodox communities said, no, we need this, and they pushed for it. And it was a long time before the two groups came together, but the success of the project continues today. It started up on Irving Avenue, where the hospitals are. Then that land was needed for hospitals. Then they moved out to East Genesee. This is from about 1970. And this is the aerial view that I took off of offline. And you can see how the physical plant has grown and grown. So it's in DeWitt. This is East Genesee coming up from Nottingham Plaza towards the city this way. Erie Boulevard is over here. And there are now several hundred people who are served there, both people who are very needy and people who retire there before they get to that stage. Socially, needs were met early on with the creation of the YMHA. There were actually efforts to create a YMHA going back to the 1860s. They failed, and they're reviving in the 1880s. Then again, in the early 20th century, things got started when the Marshall family, this is the same family of Louis Marshall, his parents died, and they donated their house, where they'd lived for 40 years, on Cedar, so there could be a new Y. And then very quickly, it was realized this wasn't big enough because kids wanted to play basketball, they wanted to have new places for debate society and meetings. So they needed to build an addition. They had to wait until after World War I, and this building was built, opened around 1918, 1919. That became the Jewish Community Center. It changed its name. And then after the war, after World War II, as the Jewish community started to move yet again further east towards the Westcott neighborhood, that area that was sold, and the Jewish community moved to Fellows and East Genesee. Building has subsequently been torn down, and most recently veterans housing opened there just a little while ago. Other institutions moved into the Westcott area. The Jewish war veterans, which got a big boost after World War II because there were so many veterans, bought an old house that had been the Republican Club, and they converted it into their clubhouse, the Jewish war veterans. They left this in the 80s, and the house was abandoned for a long time. Now it's been restored. It's called the Babcock Shattuck House after its original owners, and it's now apartments. And the JCC has moved out to DeWitt, taking over an old elementary school, but expanding it with a fitness center, a swimming pool, and most of you are probably familiar with that, just off Thompson Road. Other congregations moved out to the Westcott neighborhood. Anshe Svard, that one you saw in the wood building from 1917, took over a Victorian house, and now it's the Syracuse Peace Council. Yeah. And Young Israel, which was an Orthodox congregation, which picked up a lot of the younger Orthodox from the old centers, built a modern building on Fellows and East Genesee. It's now a medical center, and they moved further out to, which I'll show you in just a minute. The Orthodox communities couldn't sustain themselves. They all merged into one new synagogue, which is Beth El, which is out in East Genesee. Then even the Orthodoxy, that faded. They became more conservative. Men and women could sit together. But even this congregation hasn't survived, and it closed a few years ago, and it's now a Slavic Pentecostal church. And most of the stained glass have gone up to the to Menorah Park, the Jewish home. And this is the, now it's just called Shari Torah, but it was Young Israel Shari Torah, and it's an old telephone building that they purchased near Erie Boulevard. For the Orthodox, they need to live within walking distance, so the synagogue really doesn't move until people have moved. You need a critical mass, but when people move, the synagogue has to be reestablished. There's a lot happening here. Stuck. There we go. Okay. And the last big constructions were two conservative congregations out on the one on the outer edge of the city, Kimber Road, which is the new temple at Yeshurun, built between 1968 and 71 designed by the famous synagogue architect and Columbia University professor Percival Goodman. And this continues to be, I think, the largest congregation in the region today. And it's also the site of a lot of community events. And then breaking off from this is Beth Shalom Shevra Shas, which is on Jamesville Road. They wanted something a little less formal, a little less hierarchical, a little less, for them, ostentatious than the one on Kimber Road, and they created a more egalitarian conservative community. It's so egalitarian, it's hard to even find a picture of the building, and really the building wasn't built to impress architecturally, but to be a multifunctional space, and the rooms can be arranged for worship or for dinners or for lectures. I've lectured there, and so on. And that's Rabbi Pepperstone, who's the new rabbi. Okay. Are we about, we get 5 more minutes, or? Okay. Sure. There are a lot of other things. You know, you can talk about so many other aspects of Jewish Syracuse that I'm not going to go into. Theater, the movies. Greg Tripoli of OHA has recently written a couple articles about the Schubert brothers and their theater empire, which began here in Syracuse, and also a lot of the origins of Hollywood, the movie industry, and a lot of the technological developments, and also some of the legal framework for Hollywood was also developed here in Syracuse. So I won't go into that. There's also scholarship, authors, famous authors who've been here, but most people like sports better, so we'll just do a little bit of sports. So sports have been really important in the Jewish community, and that's kind of odd for a lot of people to hear, because today Jews, you know, they're accountants, they're lawyers, they're doctors. You don't think of them as being scrappy athletes. But these were immigrant kids. These were immigrant kids in the first generations of the German community, but especially those immigrant kids coming in from Eastern Europe. Part of the Americanization process was to embrace sports, to speak English, not to speak Yiddish to their parents, only to speak English, to the great dismay of the older generation. They wanted social activities that were healthy, so sports were important, and because of the weather here in Syracuse, indoor sports were important. Basketball was supreme. There, at the Y, this is 1909, so before they moved into that building in on Cedar Street, they had converted an old barn for an athletic center. Boxing, basketball, and debate. Those were the three passions for the young men in Syracuse at the time, young Jewish men. Women didn't get to do sports much, not at that time. So here's champions of the City League in 1909, the YMHA, that's the Young Men Hebrew Association team. This is much later, 1941, 1942. The YMHA Club Council League champions. So this tradition continues. They like to play the Irish a lot. The game sometimes would end in fights. Everybody kind of had a great time. So these scrappy Jewish ghetto kids, they became the next generation of Jewish leadership. Syracuse University also was very important for promoting Jewish athleticism. A couple famous football players from the early part of the 20th century, Joseph Alexander and Harry Callett. And then, you know, these guys that have been in movies recently. This is, if you saw the Jesse Owens story.
Marty Glickman.
Yeah, so this is Marty Glickman here, who was a track and field star at Syracuse, and was part of the 1936 Olympics team. And he and this guy, whose name I should remember, starts with an S, they were supposed to be part of the 4-member relay team with Jesse Owens, and they were removed from the team so that the Germans wouldn't be offended to be beaten by a black and 2 Jews. And the Americans did win, but Glickman didn't compete. They recently were honored, these 2 guys, in Berlin. Glickman went on to become a very famous broadcaster and continued a long association with Syracuse University. But so there's a tradition. And then, of course, Syracuse Jewish community's greatest star is Dolph Shays. Dolph just passed away last year. Here he is in his heyday, but he played for the Nats, and he was a coach and player, and then he was the first player coach for the 76ers when they moved to Philadelphia. And he's been honored, was honored many, many times in his life for his athleticism and for his philanthropy. And he was always a mensch. I happen to know, I think a lot of people in Syracuse knew Dolph because he was just around all the time. And that's his son Danny, who played for the Suns, also had a NBA professional career for over a dozen years too, though, as he himself will say, always in the shadow of his father. Okay, and then I won't comment, but these are just businesses that existed. This is an interesting one. It's the Cooperative Bakery on, not Harrison Bakery, which was founded in the 40s. This one was founded in 1950 by socialists, the Workmen's Circle, as a way of providing low-cost bread to the poor and also to create some income for their educational activities. Meltzer's Sandwich Shop, there's a lot of talk on that, memories of the 15th Ward about the sandwiches there, the corned beef, pastrami, and whatnot. And I assume this is one of the big, I mean, there's so many melters in Syracuse and Syracuse history. I can't keep them all straight. I know a few of them, Siegel's Pharmacy, and I like this one because it also goes back to sports. The Arena Boxing Club, Norm Rothschild, there. And then where's the community today? Well, the community's all over. I didn't show you synagogues in Auburn and Oswego. A lot of these have closed. The Auburn Synagogue recently closed, and some of the other ones have. And they've merged with other ones because they can't sustain the population. But the central communities, Concord, Addith, Beth Shalom, they actually draw people from a large area. So while the largest number of Jews have continued to move east, DeWitt, Fayetteville, Manlius, there are, the Jewish institutions tend to be in the Syracuse DeWitt area, but the membership of these congregations, they come from far, Warners and Camillus, they'll come from Central Square and Cicero and Clay, they'll come from Lafayette, Tully, Fayetteville, all over. Because, here in Onondaga County, every place is only about no more than 20 minutes away. I came from Westcott area out here, I looked at my Google map and it said 18 minutes, and I said, oh, good, I'll make it in time, plenty of time. I was here 10 minutes or 15 minutes ago. Okay, so one place where everyone gets together is the Jewish Music Festival, which takes place every summer on the campus of the JCC, and you get the from the secular to the Orthodox, that's Rabbi Rappaport of Chabad there, teaching people how to make shofars. I meant to bring my shofar and I was going to blow it for you because it's the new year. But we've got the klezmerine, that's Ken Frieden, who plays a mean klezmer clarinet, but he's also the former head of Jewish Studies at Syracuse University and one of our country's greatest Yiddish scholars. He's done a lot of important translations and commentaries. Jonathan Dinking, who is a fantastic musician. He's put out several CDs of his own compositions of religious music and other music. And I know the other guys, but I just can't remember their names. That's a great place to end, and I'll just use this shot because it emphasizes the continuing sense of community, even though the Syracuse community is much smaller than it has been for almost a century. We saw that one headline from the 1920s, 15,000 Jews. Most people don't think there are more than 7,000 Jews in the greater Syracuse area now, and a lot of them aren't even here much of the time. They may be snowbirds, or they're still keeping membership in congregations and making donations to charitable organizations, but they're not resident. So where the Jewish community of Syracuse will be in the next 10 years or 20 years remains to be seen. The big boom of the post-war years was fueled by GE, Carrier, Bristol, that needed a lot of well-educated engineers, chemists, accountants, lawyers, others who could service those corporate and manufacturing needs. Now that all those businesses have left, there are not too many new jobs that attract or can hold the next generation of educated Jewish young people. One area we do see an interesting influx is in the arts, where we have a lot of young artists and musicians and writers, though most of these people are not affiliating, or at least not yet, with the existing Jewish institutions. They're coming to Syracuse either because they were educated at SU or lawyers someplace, and they're staying, or they're just moving here because it's so affordable to live in this region. It's a lot cheaper than Williamsburg or Brooklyn or Seattle or San Francisco. So, this is a place they can actually buy a house, make a home, have a studio, and succeed. Okay, so thanks a lot for your attention.